Hello, everyone. Just stick around for a moment. We're going to kick off a really great panel. Hi, everyone. Wasn't that great? I'm so excited to introduce this panel to you. We're going to get folks up here in just about a minute, so I just wanted to ask you to just hang tight for a moment as we gather our panelists, and then we'll get started. Okay, so allow me to introduce our panel moderator, who is going to introduce the rest of our amazing panel, Dr. Saima Akhtar, who is our, yeah, that's right. Saima deserves a huge round of applause. She is amazing at Barnard. I have known Saima a very long time, and I was thrilled when she came to work here alongside me, albeit on a floor above me. Saima is the Senior Associate Director at the Vagelos Computational Science Center here at Barnard. And Saima, over to you.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Umbreen, for inviting me to be a part of this conversation. Really excited by not just the film, but our amazing panelists. So I'm going to give really short introductions because I hope during the course of the conversation the panelists can tell you a little bit more about themselves. So I'll just start in order. First, we have Kimberly Seals-Allers, who's an award-winning journalist, 5-time author, international speaker, strategist, and advocate for maternal and infant health. And then we have Susan McGregor, who's a research scholar at Columbia University's Data Science Institute, where she also co-chairs its Center for Data, Media, and Society. And we have Gina Jay, a medical anthropologist and clinically trained in internal medicine and pediatrics. Gina also teaches for the Health and Society Institute of the Barnard Pre-College Program and the Barnard Department of Anthropology. Okay. So I just want to have all of you just introduce yourselves, your work, and tell us a little bit about how you arrived in the place that you are. And so, Gina, maybe we can start with you and then go down.
Well, I as your microphone, I'm sorry. I have one of these, right? Okay. So my journey to becoming an anthropologist took some unexpected, if I had known as an undergraduate that I was going to end up becoming an anthropologist, I probably would have found a different route. But I was initially pre-med. I became a physician. I trained in internal medicine and pediatrics, and at some point in a clinical research fellowship realized I wasn't that interested in becoming an epidemiologist, and I actually was interested in doing research that involved something a lot more holistic, a lot more qualitative, yes, but also something that actually addressed sort of a broader analytic frame. So I had the opportunity to pivot my research program to to medical anthropology, and a fairly recent graduate. I graduated in 2020, and then learned how to become a professor during the pandemic. So these have all become very formative experiences for me, and I was really grateful to Barnard to give me the opportunity to actually teach this really amazing group of students during a very particular time. So my research, just briefly, is on the clinical care of children with sickle cell disease in the United States and France, and how the knowledge making around the sciences is actually happening in a very iterative way. So I very much sort of relate to the kind of knowledge making that someone in a qualitative fashion is making, such as in this film, but also with a background of talking around science from a very different frame, and how those languages can really be challenging to bridge, but also can be a very exciting place as well to have that communication happen. So I'm really excited to speak with my cohort here about some of those questions.
Thank you. Susan.
Hello. Oh, wow. Very complicated question that I'm going to try to answer briefly. I think if I had been several years younger, I would have been considered a maker as a child. Like that kind of, I've always liked making things and building things. And as a sort of teenager, I was very interested in technology, partly for the technology, but also more broadly, because I felt like technology had a lot of creative capacity. I thought it would give me independence to be in technology. And so I actually studied computer science as an undergraduate in the days, which may still be with us, where it was, 90% men. And that was a very unsatisfying experience. But I was also very interested in writing. I had always loved nonfiction writing. And I figured out at the end of my undergrad years that I somehow never knew what editorial writing was. And so I joined my school newspaper, and I was like, I want to go into journalism. And I ended up joining the Wall Street Journal a couple of years out of college, and working on visualization. And I was very interested in kind of how data was communicated, because growing up when I did, it was like there's this onslaught of information. How can we make sense of it? And after a few years in the newsroom, I realized that thinking about what could be new and different was not going to happen in the industry, right? You're too busy doing the thing. And an opportunity came up here at Columbia. And so I joined the School of Journalism, and I was there for many years. But I started doing research, and I joined Columbia at a time when it was in 2011, sort of in the Arab Spring moment, and Occupy Wall Street. And because I had a technical background, I became very aware of the kind of safety and security concern, the ways that technology could expose people to risk, that I think was not very evident to a lot of my colleagues because I had a technical background. And so for many years now, I've done work on safety and security for journalists and media organizations. And in the last few years, that has, unfortunately, or of necessity, evolved, actually I shouldn't say unfortunately, to a focus on harassment and abuse, particularly online harassment and online abuse. So I will say, in watching this film, when we sort of got to that part of it, I thought, oh, okay, we're at this part now. And I think something that for me, a turn that happened for me a couple of years ago, I collaborate mostly with computer scientists. I publish mostly into computer science as a discipline. I had been working with wonderful collaborators on identifying, I thought if we can see it coming, right? Like if we can find the stuff, the abusive tweets and whatever, right, that's coming, and we can filter it and we give people control over it, that would be something. And at a certain point I thought, it's still gonna happen, right? Like we can reduce it by 95%, but it's still gonna happen. And I was tired of spending my energy worrying about what the terrible people were doing and trying to figure out how to stop them. And I was like, I just want to support the people who are doing the work. right? Is there a way to make it possible for people to continue working and feel safe in what they're doing, even though there's all this noise out here? So that's, how I came to the work largely how I came to the work that I do now. And it's funny, it is qualitative mostly. And I'm looking forward to hearing from everyone, because I found the critiques that were through the film of the methodology is hilarious. But I'm sure there's probably something I'm missing there too. So
We'll get there. Kimberly.
Hi, thank you so much. I think similarly, I come to this work through the lens of journalism. I'm a journalist by trade, a former senior editor at Essence, a former writer at Fortune magazine for many years, worked on the business desk of the New York Post. Rupert Murdoch sent me to London. I worked for his newspapers out there. So I have always had a passion for storytelling and generating data through people, right? So I think that is often the source of my work. My fifth book, which was actually about looking at breastfeeding through the lens of feminism, through the lens of how people are making choices about how they feed their baby, was also an exploration of people's stories as a source of data. And I think that has been the continuous thread in my work, that I think of stories as a source, right, and as a source of data. And then, as I decided in my mid-40s, which I do not recommend, to become a tech founder, I had this deep belief that stories had power to change systems. And so, after writing, doing books, and so now my technology nonprofit, we've created the first Yelp-like platform for Black and brown women and birthing people to find and leave reviews of their OBGYNs, birthing hospitals, and pediatricians, right? So we're all about using our stories as a source of data. On the back end, we turn these reviews into actual data to help hospitals improve their care of Black birthing families, because they are disproportionately dying underneath the system. Thank you. We're now working with hospitals in 8 states, but one of the things I'm most challenged by but proud of is this kind of movement that we're in to lift up qualitative research, because I also felt very much aligned and felt the kindred spirit around the criticisms, but the value of women's stories, the value of birthing people's stories, is something that I stand for and actually turn into data every day. So it's been an interesting journey to think of myself as a storyteller, but also a person who takes other people's stories. But I think this is the future of real data that can actually push for meaningful change, and not the patriarchal stuff that was created as a social construct to literally silence primarily women's voices in this domain.
So all of you are skipping ahead to my second to last question. So I'm just going to go straight there. And at the risk of answering this question before I ask it, I noticed in reading a bit about all of your work that you're all storytellers, all of you. Through data, whether it's stories about patient populations that you work with, in the case of Gina and Kimberly, or through journalism and creating technology to ensure privacy or minimize the flow of information, like Susan, you were talking about. So I don't know if you see yourselves as arriving to quote unquote STEM first, or arriving to STEM through humanities and social science fields. My question is, how do you see the relationship between the two, and how do you see one needing the other or informing the other? And some of you have already kind of talked about this in your research. So maybe Kimberly, you can pick up from where you were.
Yeah, I feel like all things must be informed by lived experience, right? And so when we think about STEM, for me, it's always for whom, right? And at what cost? And those kind of questions, which I think we don't answer. But I think that having that lived experience is the thing that can make everything better. Because we can look at technology, we can look at the ways that technology has actually contributed to inequities, right? So unless we're focused on the lived experience, unless we're focused on designing for those who, we need to be centered in that experience, then we're still gonna come up short, even though it can appear to be very advanced, right? I remember going into bathrooms, trying to wash my hands at automated faucets, and this doesn't work, right? this doesn't work for me. I had to do this, right? And so amazing technology, not built for people with black and brown skin. So what is the purpose of science, technology, engineering, or any of these fields if they're not to advance equity? So that is really my question to answer your question and how I look at it, right? How are all these disciplines actually advancing equity? How are they trying to censor those who have been marginalized? How are they trying to change systems of oppression? Because if they're not doing that, then I'm asking, for what purpose do they exist?
Yes. Susan.
No, I think that's such a wonderful point, and it draws to mind about a year ago I was invited to moderate a panel that was lawyers and computer scientists, and it was dealing with issues of security and privacy and how can we meld the technology and the law to do better, basically, in this country, right? And one of the legal panelists sort of opened, or maybe it was the moderator, sort of opened, they say that, you know, the purpose of law, this must have been a scholar, right? The purpose of law is to like advance justice and good. And I was like, wouldn't it be fascinating if the science, like computer science, for example, had something like that at its center, which it absolutely does not as a field, right? Like it's the idea, and I think many computer scientists, it's changing. First of all, I would say even in the 10 plus years I've been doing this, it is evolving enormously. But you know, it's like you'd sort of say, well, to what purpose, or how are people impacted by this? And it's like, that's not my job. My job is to figure out the technology. I'm gonna, improve the efficiency of the algorithm. I'm gonna figure out the math. And so I think I completely agree with you, but I also think that view is one that is actually, frankly, fairly recent to the field, at least in computer science in my experience. And that's not a normative judgment of the people in it. It was just, I think that now in particular, I'm very fascinated by the history of technology, and it's interesting, like a lot of the things that we take for granted now that feel very easy were really, really hard to do. And so a lot of what has emerged, the people who were doing it could never have predicted. And I think that's why the onus is on us now to say, well, this is here, this is happening. Now we gotta take control of it and begin asking that question of for whom, to what end, et cetera. Because, it is massively changing, and in many cases, it's simply replicating inequalities that already exist and scaling them, replicating them at scale.
Thank you. Gina.
I mean, just building on both of these points, and in my doctoral program, even though there was a public health focus, one of the leading scholars at the time, Joan Phelan and Bruce Link, and their theory of fundamental causes for, I'm going to get a little wonky, but I will get to the point. But so they, if some of your sociologists in the room, what they point out is, why is it that, as a society we have these incredible technologies, these incredibly effective interventions, we have all of these capacities and knowledge around improving public health, improving preventive care, improving treatments for what were once very morbid and fatal diseases. So given that, why are we seeing the persistence of what seem to be very entrenched inequities in health outcomes? And what they point to is actually, it's by virtue of those breakthroughs, quote unquote breakthroughs, that we actually not only reproduce, but even can widen those inequities. Because if those who are in our stratified social system, those who have access to resources are going to be the earliest beneficiaries of those interventions, and we saw that blow open during our pandemic. It made that very real for the general public, I think, in a very vivid and proximate way. And that doesn't just apply to health, that applies to every innovation, really. So if our access to resources is going to determine who's going to benefit, who will benefit most, who will benefit earliest, and we don't have a mindful strategy of implementation that actually takes into account, we actually need to, we have this wonderful intervention. What is going to be, who is going to benefit first? How are we going to actually address the resource inequities that are actually going to underlie, if someone needs to have insurance that's going to pay for a $2 million gene therapy, who will possibly be able to benefit from that, versus someone who does, is uninsured, or not living in a country where that particular intervention is even going to be marketed in the first place.
I think, so reflecting on that a bit and then just trying to pull out some of the themes from the film. One of the things that was like so frustrating for me to watch, as I'm sure it was for many of us, is the invalidation of some of the main findings of Cher's research. Partly because of who she was and the time in which she was operating, but also partly because of the way that she was collecting her data. And so this question kind of gets at, Susan, what you were saying is the meaning of what is scientific. And there's this sort of myth of neutrality surrounding the scientific process and its methodologies, that in a sense, if done correctly, the process of scientific discovery should be free of social and political bias. So the question really is, if you can reflect on this and maybe comment about it in your own journey, about the way you've kind of arrived at your research, the way in which you conduct your research, whether it's qualitative or quantitative or a combination of the two. And Susan, maybe we can start with you.
Sure, thank you. So I hope you'll forgive me if I do a little nitpick, which is I don't think they invalidated her findings at all. Like, it was total bullshit, right? There was no invalidation. Like, that was the thing. It was a character assassination. It was it was a takedown, but I don't think there was any invalidation, because the methodologies that, I don't know who that man was in Oprah's audience who decided that the five, it's like, okay, and, but I think, and that's sort of the point, and that certainly, like, in those scenes, right, like, I imagine, some of whom are people that I've spoken to, right, the people who are targeted online, right, and it's like, everybody is coming at you, and you're supposed to, respond, and I thought it was so fascinating, in the film, how frequently people said, she's saying this, she's saying this. She was never the one saying it. She was reporting what was said to her, right? But like, to be that lightning rod, right? And I think that, I imagine, right, that is part of what is exhausting. Like, I have to confess, I haven't read the books, but like, the data is clearly there. She didn't manufacture 10,000 responses. And so I think that desire to, create a focal point, is really, obviously this work touched many nerves in many ways, and there was a huge desire to take it down. I think for me, there's like so many things that, when I was an undergraduate, I actually did not end up finishing in computer science. So I started out enrolled as a computer science major, and I had not a very good experience. Let's just say that. And I ended up applying to do a so-called special concentration, a custom major. And it took 3 tries because they kept turning me down. And eventually, a social psychologist who was on the committee kind of said, let's talk about what you're doing. And it was at the point where I was like, I'm either going to do this or I'm going to transfer schools. Like, they're going to give this to me or I'm out of here because this is ridiculous. And I remember I was very interested in information visualization, what would very soon, in a couple of years, be known as usability, right? Because I knew about computers, and I had taken a year off, I had worked in an office, and I had seen people struggle with their technology. And I knew that the computer could do everything they wanted it to do, but they didn't know how to make it happen. And I would try to articulate this to people when they said, what are you interested in? And eventually I got down to, I want to make computers easier to use. And they said, well, I don't know how you do that, but God bless you, right? Like this is 20 plus years ago, like people were just overwhelmed. And I had a conversation with this man, with this mentor of mine at one point, and he said, well, why aren't you doing this in the computer science department? And I said, because they don't think this is computer science, right? This doesn't count. How people use the computers. Now, the fact that it's a lump of metal and plastic without a human to use it, right? There are no computers without people. They don't do anything. This is not biology. This is not nature. It's not physics. It doesn't go on without us. But the idea that you would be focused on how the person can use the computer and interact with it did not have traction at the time. And it has since gained some traction. But so for me, I think by the time I got to a research position, I knew kind of what the norms and, I don't know, like prejudices were. And I was fortunate to be coming, I think, or I felt that I was in a position where when I went into the scientific space, because I do not yet have a PhD, I had nothing to lose. Right? So I could go in as a little bit of an instigator and say, well, why are you doing this? Why are you making this choice? And I wasn't really looking for these people to validate me. And, as such, it gave me a latitude because I had no stakes. And in many ways, these people had no influence over my future. And it has actually been a surprisingly positive experience. But I've also been very, I would say, aggressive in my selection of whom I work with and where I work for that reason. So,
I'm going to start. I'm going to start by saying I think that we don't even understand what science is, right? And so we think of science in very definite terms, but actually science is the process of discovery. And we're looking for finite answers, but that's actually not what science is. Science is a journey of discovery that is supposed to lead us to more inquiry and more journeying, whatever, but we don't think about science that way. So I also think like we have a communication problem around what science is that fundamentally makes people look at things as being definitive when then that never was meant to be, right? So, and I think that's a problem. And then you layer that on to what we saw in the film, which is the ways that data or scientific processes led by women, for women, and people is often dismissed, right? And so, and then in our work, what we know is like we look at women as a marginalized groups, and you look at Black people as a deeply more marginalized groups with a history of systemic oppression. And in my work, what it takes in terms of data to actually get people to believe what Black people say matters to them is deeply disgusting, right? I know every day that the numbers, we have over 20,000 users in our platform, reviews from 46 states. When I go into a hospital, usually because our data is showing that they're mistreating Black and brown birthing people, they of course are in denial. I go through the same thing where they're questioning. How did you do it? What did you do it? Blah, 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 blah. I don't even engage in those conversations, right? And I tell people, my theory of change is I listen to Black people. That's number one. And number two, I also know that if I had presented them with 20 reviews from white women saying some of these similar complaints, they would be moving into action. But I have to present 10 times that amount of data for them to actually believe it. And the other thing that's really important as we think about this is issues of power and control, which of course have also been tools against women in general and certainly against Black people in this country, because, and my staff knows this, one of my favorite screenshots, and I love to take this picture when I present to hospitals about what we do. We want to help them. We can help them improve their care. We bring them into a 2-year process. We're going to generate reviews, analyze them, we get great data. They're like, no, thank you. I'm like, okay, well, let's look at what we already have on you, because I can open the app and show them that we actually already have reviews on them. And they are flabbergasted. How did you get that? I don't need your permission to go to my community and ask them for feedback. So this idea of control over data is often part of it, right? And we know that the biggest problem with Cher was like she didn't ask permission to ask women about their sexuality, right? And so for me, you can't like disentangle these conversations without thinking about issues of power and control, the ways that those have been used to exert power over women's bodies, over Black people, over other marginalized groups in this country, which all comes back to, you know, how data is used and, you know, how data has been used even in service of or in harm of women, right? And so this is critically important. Also in our work, I will say that there are a number of academic institutions that would love to work with us. I refuse all the time. The reason why I refuse is because I let them know your processes have not yielded any good, right? We've done RCTs and this one and that one and that one. Show me where that's helped women, you know, or Black people, and then we can have a conversation, right? We're still suffering under a wage gap, under which Black women still have the greatest wage gap, right, among women. So all of these processes have not helped. And so I categorically reject them. We don't work with academic institutions as a matter of practice and, for me, of value, because we are decidedly centering the lived experience, right? That is the only thing I'm interested in. You know, yes, we turn our data into numbers in service of helping hospitals improve, but this idea that we have to be validated, and people say that we can validate your model. No, thank you. Not interested, right? I am here for people. Like, we are validated by the people that we serve, and that is enough for me, right? And so I think that if we could continue to disrupt some of these systems, when we think about this hierarchy around data, it was created by a group of white men around the turn of the century. I've done the research. Like, someone said, this was at the top of the chain, this was viral, this was this, and then it put actual voices of people at the bottom. Someone made that shit up. I'm just like, we don't really have to subscribe to that. We could create something new as a new generation of women and creators and people and femmes and say, nah, we're not doing that anymore. And that's what I'm more interested in. Like, I'm trying to find those people who are like, no, we're not doing that. We're creating something new, and we're going to validate ourselves through our voices and maybe through other more novel means. I'm here for that. But this way of approaching things has not served us, and it's really important that we say that and think about something new.
Gina, would you like to add to that?
I mean, I can only just express my immense admiration as to the words and experience that I'm in the presence of, because I'm you know, here on the stage with two people in journalism and media. I did actually, if I don't mind, may I ask a little bit about how, you know, we're already at this place where, you know, we hear a lot about this sort of fractured media environment. It's sort of a nice reminder that there wasn't really a golden age of media to begin with, right? So you know, that we should look at that critically always. But you know, this was also an important reminder, I think, that the venues that we have to share information, you know, and whether we want to call some of these examples in the film news or not, again, I'm going to defer to the journalists in the room. But how, you know, how do we disengage this idea of wanting to, you know, address an actual, you know, an important question about validity, methods, when clearly there was a, you know, capital incentive to get as many eyeballs, viewing in exchange. Like the goal was not, sharing information. The goal was to, reproduce this media environment. And how do we, as activists and as scholars who actually, do have important information to share with the public, that we want to make it relevant for people's lives. Like, how do we navigate, and be mindful of, how do we like avoid the trap, right? that we're speaking about.
Yeah, one of the things that I think has been important in the data conversation, and part of this is my answer to data for whom is, like in our platform, our data belongs to the community, something else that people don't like, right? Our reviews are transparent. We report data back to the community on a regular basis. Every grant that I get says that I report my data to the community before I do it to my funder. That is another part. So I think that we can actually sidestep the media shows when we're actually building a relationship and reporting directly to communities, right? Because this way we get to tell our stories ourselves, and the only way to do that is to tell your story yourself. Once it goes through an interpretation vehicle, I think someone said this, sometimes all media is good media, but sometimes maybe not, right? And so if there were more, what we love to see is how do we take academic research that, kind of comes from an ivory tower, was actually made for other academics, then we allow the media to interpret it, and they're not trained to do that, so they just extrapolate the 1 or 2 points that they think will make it on Good Morning America, right? Or a headline for clickbait, and then the actual value of so much research is truly lost because we're using this, funneling method that is only going to get a lot more bad outcomes coming out of it, right? Because most journalists have not been trained to report on science, right? And so, for me, it's about how do we get that data to the community? And if the media gets it, that's fine, but we haven't relied on them as our communication medium, which often is what happens. People don't want to go to the people directly. They don't know how. They're so disengaged from actually being in community, they wouldn't know where to start. And for me, if you have meaningful research that could actually impact the people, go to the people that it's going to impact. So that would be, kind of the way I think about how we sidestep or can, avoid some of these things when we're in direct communication.
I would just add, whatever, okay. This is something that I think about a lot too, just that we have a huge problem with representation in the media industry, right? Which is that the media is completely non-representative. And I've been fortunate in some of my work to collaborate with organizations that are, that are more diverse, that are not news organizations per se, but I think also, just to admit my ignorance, right now, I think if you want to reach people, I think you start a podcast. Seriously though, even in research, right, we have this problem. It's I don't think, some of the work that I'm doing now is people are not going, younger people in particular, right? And I don't think this is a bad thing, are not going to the traditional media outlets. That's not where they get their information. That's not how they're making their decisions. I think fortunately, there are a lot of ways that people can connect with their communities better. I do think that the loss of local news is actually a huge problem that is contributing to this fracturing, and that's an area that has been gutted in many ways for a really long time for many reasons. But I can't agree more that I think you always have to go where people are. There's also just the fact that the people who are running major news organizations today, for the most part, are the same people who were running them 20 years ago. And I don't mean the same type of people, I mean the same people, right? And meanwhile, all this stuff has happened, but the same people are there. And I was in one of those newsrooms, and it was we were not talking the same language, right? So I think there is something, I think there's something to appreciate about that when we think about the media landscape, and particularly, communicating science. I think there is a great benefit that now, scientists and researchers can be in direct communication and bring some of that nuance that just does not make it out in a traditional media report.
Yeah, I think that one part of this is science communication, and another part of it is where the science and the research is done. And that takes me just to one final thought about the film, which is that the constraints of the institution. And so Cher drops out of her PhD program saying it's just too conservative of an environment. Columbia's too conservative. She feels dismissed. And so 50 years on, just reflecting on this, how have things changed? But also, Kimberly, you're starting to talk about creating alternative spaces, right? And so this is gonna be a couple questions rolled into one, but if we want to abide by the term feminist science, what do you see as feminist science? Where do you see this happening? And if the institutions as they are don't allow this kind of work to happen, how then do we create, or where do we turn to, and how do we invite people into spaces where they're not currently allowed to do this kind of work? So I know that that was a lot, but pick the threads that you feel like pricking. And Kimberly, it looks like you want to say something.
No, I was going to be last. Well, first let me say, as a graduate of Columbia University Graduate School of Journalism, it's unfortunate that those feelings, certainly I felt them, at Columbia as a Black woman. And yeah, that's very sad that not much has changed. It's deeply troubling. And, that's for other smart people to figure out. I will say that there are two things I always preface this by saying. I think for me, the term feminism is a little bit charged. As a Black woman, I see myself more as a womanist because feminism had failed to really include Black women in that conversation. So I just need to say that, but I'm using the word in your understanding of it. And then I think that, what I also appreciate about the film was in the ways that Cher needed to be or wasn't comfortable being critiqued. I think feminism suffers similarly, where you can't say anything bad about it. And that probably needs to change for us to truly get to a version that could work for everybody, right? And so that part needs to be addressed, and that's the internal work that we need to do within those of us who care about what's happening to women and people with uteruses in this country. So I just want to say that as a level set. My vision, right, for what feminism data or womanist data could look like would be, work that we lead, work that actually benefits other people, particularly women and families. That's really important to me. And I don't know how we can get there because, to the point that's made, much of the funding, we think about academic institutions still being oppressive places. It's like, sometimes it could feel like there is a lot to scale for us to get there on a meaningful level. But what I am very optimistic about is because we also have direct access to people, the same way that we think about the research having direct access to people, we have direct access to people to start our own conversations and our own movements about what could that look like that actually served feminist ideals or womanist ideals. And I don't think we're having that conversation. That concerns me. And so I don't really have a good answer to that question because I feel like I'm also questioning that and hopeful that other people will figure it out. But we're not there, and I don't think it's going to happen under the current systems, right? Like, it's not going to happen, with all love and respect to Columbia, right? It needs to come from me from an outside system because, we talk about the systems being broken or the system being fixed, right? The system is working exactly as it was designed. It wasn't designed for Black people, and it really wasn't designed for women either. So I'm not sure it's going to be the source of something that moves us forward. What can we create outside of that could disrupt that is the conversation I'm really interested in having and thinking about who are all the people that need to be at the table to create disruption to that. So I say stay tuned, and guys, invite me to the meeting when we get that one together.
Sheena, and then Susan. And these are going to be some of our final thoughts and getting the sign that these are our last few minutes.
So I did want to point. I did find it interesting, and I in the little clip where Cher's interviewed on the Colbert Report, which was fairly recently, and it did strike me that, you know, even though her name may not be attached to knowledge about the clitoris and that being part of, you know, that knowledge seems to have emerged. Like that knowledge seems to have happened, just that her name was not, you know, it's not called the Cher Height, you know, body of knowledge, even though, you know, it's not really questioned today. I was just thinking, yesterday I saw one of the documentaries where someone was dressed in a costume of the clitoris, right? Like this is, and so when I think a little bit about academic work, I do find it interesting whose names persist, who stays on the syllabus, and whose might fall off. And you know, so when you know it became a popular hashtag, and but it bears mentioning and reminding, you know, when you say like hashtag cite Black women, cite underrepresented scholars, you bring them into the conversation, and even though we might be serving an academic institution immediately, you know, it's part of why I love teaching undergraduates and I love teaching high school students, because you know, they haven't drank the Kool-Aid. There's so many directions those minds can go, and I also credit a dear colleague of mine who is a math professor. He's a tenured math professor, and he implements non-hierarchical grading. And when I was preparing my first classes, I was thinking, this is someone who teaches, you know, courses on data science for like, you know, a group of 70 students. Surely, if he can do a non-hierarchical process of learning that's not attached to a grade, surely my social sciences seminar can achieve the same thing. And when we actually find ways of making that learning environment inclusive and having people's minds be, gain the tools that will carry them forward for their own independent learning for the rest of their lives, we hope to like start implementing those tools to make, you know, the academy not be just another, place where we're competing against one another for knowledge, when that knowledge should actually just be free and available. So some of those structures we can actually try to implement in these places, these ivory towers, and hopefully, and those students go on, right? I certainly was a lifelong student, but those students will go on and do, potentially, raise their own movements, become entrepreneurs, journalists, and change makers.
Thank you. Susan, do you want to say one last?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, first of all, you're obviously at that table. Like, this is a table. You're setting it. Thank you. It's hard and it's complicated, right? I've always felt institutions don't have principles, but people do, right? Like, institutions aren't honest per se, but people within them can be. And I think that, remember that you can use the institution, right? Like, because you're here, like sometimes when I work with postdoctoral scholars and things like that, I'm like, whatever happened, you've got a columbia.edu address now, right? And when you send an email to someone randomly, like when I came to Columbia, nobody knew who I was, right? I was like, I had been, toiling away in a newsroom. But if I sent an email, people were like, yeah, sure, I'll come give a critique in your class, you know? And so I think there's something, you know, it doesn't have to be a one-way street. You know, I think in terms of bringing people into the spaces, I think sometimes it's as simple as literally bringing them into the space. You know, in a lot of computer science, there is still a lot of empirical data collection, and you know, people are interested in problems. They're like, well, let's, you know, we want to find out, you know, this or that, and we're going to collect social media data, or we're going to do this or that. And I'm like, or, and this is true, you could hire someone from that community to your research team and ask them, right? Like, what are the problems that you're dealing with? What are the challenges, right? Because what empirical data, right, which is always designed by somebody decided what to measure. Somebody decided how to measure it. That was a decision-making process that included some things and excluded others. So there's nothing neutral about that, ever. But, you know, by bringing people into that process, you skip all of this other stuff. And frankly, it's just better science. Because the data, those numbers, right, they can tell you what, but they cannot tell you why. They cannot tell you why. And that's what you need to know if you want to advance knowledge, if you want to understand, like, you know, statisticians go to all these lengths, like, to generate causal inference. Right? Oh, we have the statistics, but why is it happening? If it's about people, you can just ask the people, and they will tell you, you know? And I think that's why, to me, this divide between the qualitative and the quantitative is false, because you can't really move forward without both of them.
Thank you. I think that's a fantastic note to end on. Thank you, Kimberly, Susan, and Gina. Thanks for Athena for bringing us here for this conversation.